All right, well, welcome everyone back this afternoon for the final plenary of the 2024 UNC Water and Health Conference. Thank all of you for making it this far. For those of you who've been with us from the start, thank you. It has been quite a journey, and so we appreciate your strength and stamina to be able to be here for the whole week. For those of you who joined us today, welcome. I'm very excited about today's final plenary speaker. So I'm going to go through a slightly lengthy introduction just to give you guys a little bit of a perspective about who and where this person comes from. So Secretary Beiser is now the president of Beiser Strategies, LLC, but this is an environmental consulting firm, but in 2021, North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper appointed Secretary Beiser to serve as the secretary of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, where she served until September 2024. And she was the first woman to hold this title. In August 2023, she was elected by her peers to serve as the president of the Environmental Council of States, which is a U.S. entity that has all of our counterparts and colleagues from across the United States working together. It's a national nonprofit, nonpartisan association of these territorial environmental agency leaders. Under Secretary Beiser's leadership, DEQ developed the action strategy for PFAS and took proactive steps to prepare public water systems for federal drinking water limits. She has led DEQ's efforts to propose state groundwater and surface water standards to reduce the amount of PFAS entering the environment and ensure that residents are not paying the entire cost of the cleanup for PFAS, something we heard a little bit about this morning. Additionally, she's been an outspoken advocate of ensuring the entire life cycle of PFAS is addressed. And this is an issue I hope comes up in our conversation because it's something we don't talk a lot about in our conversations here. By recently petitioning the EPA Environmental Protection Agency to list 4 PFAS compounds as hazardous air pollutants. She successfully oversaw the implementation, and I mentioned this morning, but I want to repeat it again here, over $6.5 billion, and again that's with a B, in state and federal investments to improve water and sewer infrastructure in communities throughout the state. And she led the effort to ensure that historic funding helped the communities that needed it the most, which resulted in hundreds of North Carolinians being connected for the first time to public water services. So it's with great pleasure that I ask Secretary Elizabeth Beiser to come on up and join me. Thank you. No, please. Sorry. We started off this way this morning, and I want to do it again with you, if that's okay, because we have a lot of young students in the audience. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about yourself and how you actually ended up as the secretary of DEQ.
That's a long story, so I'll make it as short as possible. But it really started when I was a child. I really was interested in environmental issues, and at that point, acid rain was a big issue, and I was fascinated by it. I learned about it in school. I did my own research, and my dad was in local government. So I had a love of the environment, and then I had a love of government watching him. He was a county manager at the time. He's retired now. But watching all that he was doing to help people every day, and in fact, since we're have just dealt with a hurricane with Helene in the mountains, I'll mention one of the kind of turning points for me of wanting to get involved in public service was after Hurricane Fran hit our state. So that was back in 1996, probably before a lot of the students here were born, but we had the eye of the hurricane come over our house. And so you can imagine we had a lot of devastation, and I was 12 years old at the time, and I volunteered answering the phones for my dad to tell people where to get tarps, listen to FEMA briefings, things that 12-year-olds usually love to do. But that path will fast forward to college. And after seeing a flyer on a wall for an internship program in state government, I thought I'll be in Raleigh. I knew I didn't really want to do local government. Let me try out state government. So I went to the legislature and interned for the state senator who was the bill sponsor for the Clean Smokestacks Act, which for those of you who are not familiar with North Carolina, this is one of the most significant pieces of environmental legislation in North Carolina's history that required putting scrubbers on coal-fired power plants to improve the air quality, especially in Western North Carolina, who had suffered quite significantly. And so that was the moment that my love of the environment and my love of policy and government came together. And so the rest was history. I actually started working for the department that I just finished leading when I was fresh out of college as the Director of Legislative Affairs for about 4.5 years, and then had the fortune, after spending some time in the private sector and the nonprofit sector, had the fortune to return to lead it as secretary.
So then, what's your background? I mean, are you a scientist or?
I'm a political scientist.
A political scientist. Okay.
So, a double tar heel. So I have an undergrad in political science and a master of public administration, both from UNC. And so you might think, how does somebody with a political science degree go on to do a lot of science? But I've been very fortunate to have a lot of on-the-job teachers. I'll say early in my career, being the legislative director gave me exposure to the entire department. You get to learn a little bit about everything because you have to deal with whatever the crisis of the day is, and that means that you're gonna get exposure to all of the big issues. And then, I've been very fortunate that people want to teach you when you're in these positions, and so I've learned so much from the team that I work with at DEQ. We have 1,700 wonderful employees across the state. Also from partnerships with researchers from the university system and from many, many others. So I'm a student of science that way.
No, that's great. Because I'm kind of curious then, what do you see as the skill sets that have been most important for you to be able to succeed in your job? I'll come back to DEQ in a second, but I'm curious.
This may be a surprising answer, but my background as a lobbyist actually helped me more than anything else did. When you think about lobbying, lobbyists get a bad rap. Everybody thinks lobbyists and they think special interest. But what lobbying really does is it teaches you how to do stakeholder engagement. It teaches you how to find common ground on issues, how to talk about issues in a way that people can hear you. So that means thinking about the audience that you're conversing with, what matters to them, how do you connect with them in order to make progress. And so a lot of ways, when you're a secretary of a department or leading an agency, you're an ambassador of sorts for your agency, whether that's with the legislature and trying to get additional resources, or whether it's trying to bring folks together around a complicated issue to find a path forward. It's a lot of that stakeholder engagement and reading people and helping them come along to a common solution.
I've always talked about mediation that way, that everybody should take conflict resolution and mediation training to understand how you resolve disputes, how you can better understand where people are coming from and thinking. I'd never thought about that with lobbyists, so that's a great connection. Okay, a little bit about DEQ. What is DEQ and what do they do, and how do they fit into the state's responsibilities for managing all these types of challenges that we're talking about?
Sure. Well, the Department of Environmental Quality is the state environmental regulatory agency. And so every state has a state regulatory agency. And just a fun fact to think about is that state agencies implement and enforce over 90% of the nation's environmental laws. So this is really, truly where the rubber hits the road. We cover, I'm going to still say we because it's a very fresh leaving DEQ, cover air, land, water quality. You think about it as regulatory and non-regulatory. And so it's everything from, like I said, enforcing the Clean Water Act and implementing the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act to also, business assistance. We have the Environmental Stewardship Initiative, which works with companies who want to go beyond environmental compliance to be stewards and to go zero waste or reduce their carbon emissions. And so we do everything from that to grant making. You mentioned the $6.5 billion for infrastructure investment. And in fact, the Division of Water Infrastructure Director, Shadi Eskoff, is here, who has been directly leading that program. But we oversee grants just like that, also grants for EV charging infrastructure. There's a wide variety of things, environmental education, recycling, that the department does. But basically, if it's having to do with the environment and how we're protecting it, it usually falls under the purview of DEQ.
So if we're thinking about the carrots and sticks you might have as DEQ to help motivate change within the state, what do those look like?
So there's the obvious ones. So we have, rules and regulations and laws, and some of those are coming from, those powers come from the federal government. You heard from Administrator Regan this morning. EPA has, kind of the broad oversight of programs that we're implementing, like Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, but Safe Drinking Water Act. There's many, but what we're doing is, as we're implementing those programs, we have those kind of formal powers, if you will, at our disposal. There's also soft power. When we ask questions, I'll give you an example. We'll probably talk about emerging contaminants today.
We will.
And PFAS has been a huge issue in North Carolina, and we can talk more about why that is later. But we have a lot of companies that use PFAS as a part of the process beginning to locate in North Carolina, not beginning, but continuing to locate in North Carolina, like chip manufacturers, EV battery manufacturing. And so we ask questions up front about fluorinated compounds so that we can understand what's happening and try to avoid the situation that we already have in the southeastern part of the state, where one facility contaminated at least an 8-county region. We tell them it's in their best interest and our best interest to make sure that we're talking about these issues up front, regardless of whether or not there are technical limits in place yet. Because there's not, for example, a water quality standard in place, it doesn't give you free rein to put as much PFAS into the water as you would like. Right. So there are, it's a combination, but typically we mostly rely on those permitting powers, enforcement powers, both from the states and feds.
Interesting. And so I get the regulation side of this, and I get how that all fits together, and the soft powers that you have to regulate. Who are your key stakeholders? Whose interests are you trying to meet, and how do you balance those?
So the main stakeholder is the people of North Carolina. So this is maybe a good time to say our mission is to provide science-based environmental stewardship for the health and prosperity of all North Carolinians. And so what that means is really, first and foremost, we're looking out for public health, making sure that you can drink clean water, that you can breathe clean air. We say without that, nothing else matters. So we want to ensure that we are protecting the environment for the future, for the current and for the future. But we also have other stakeholders in that process. So we have the regulated community, those who are needing permits from us, or are operating within the state and under our purview. There's also NGOs. So they have an interest, they push us from the other side, right? So you get pushed from all these different sides of all the different stakeholders who have, want things to be more strict or less strict. And so usually I say we're doing our job whenever everybody's mad. If everybody's mad, then we usually have struck the right balance of getting it where we're being protective, using common sense, and ensuring that we're balancing all the many interests of the people of North Carolina.
We talked a little bit about this morning, and wonder if you have some of the same challenges of how the court system is being used, and is that changing right now, given some of the recent Supreme Court decisions in ways that are either helpful or hurtful to what the mission might be of DEQ?
The courts certainly are, I'll just say, a recent wild card. Right. I'm sure you heard this morning, and I won't belabor the federal cases that have been decided recently. That certainly, I think we're just still yet to see some of the impact. I think we'll continue to see impacts from those cascading for years to come. But at the state level, we also have some challenges. One example is, there's been disagreements between the Environmental Management Commission and the Rules Review Commission. So the way the rulemaking process works in North Carolina is that the Environmental Management Commission is supposed to be the rulemaking body for the department. And then all rules then go to the Rules Review Commission for consistency review, making sure that you're in compliance with the authorizing regulations and laws. But that process has been politicized recently. And so 1,4-dioxane is a great example. I don't know how much that's been discussed thus far, but that's an emerging contaminant that's of concern, especially in North Carolina. So North Carolinians have the third highest exposure to 1,4-dioxane, which is a likely carcinogen of any state in the country. So that's been a big issue here. So the department had moved forward, and this was prior to my tenure, with narrative standards and numeric standards. So narrative standards are, it's an EPA formula. So whenever you're doing rulemaking, you have to have a bioaccumulation factor and a reference dose. And that gets input into a formula that then produces what's called a narrative standard. And so narrative standards are very commonly used, not just in North Carolina, but across the country. And it's meant to fill a gap. So whenever you need to act more quickly than perhaps a full rulemaking process, you see that there's a hazard that needs to be addressed, and it's a way to quickly be able to address that hazard. Numerical standards are set through rulemaking processes, which can take, typically under normal circumstances, take about 18 months. So that is not a very quick process, but it's one that can consider some other factors. Well, for 1,4-dioxane, it got held up with the RRC. They said that we didn't have the ability. There was something, they took issue with the fiscal note. And then the legislature got involved and potentially was going to take away the ability to do narrative standards at all. That got pulled back, thank goodness, because I believe we probably would have been the only state in the country to have done that. So there's been a number of challenges along those lines, and then politics interfere in various places. So the composition of the EMC shifted after some legislation that passed, and then the EMC removed their case against the RRC, and pulled back on the 1,4-dioxane rulemaking. So we've seen a lot of things like that. We've seen issues with the administrative law judges making decisions along the same lines. So it's certainly made the process, and not to mention, I've been a very vocal proponent for PFAS groundwater and surface water standards, and even the EMC has now been politicized, and so you're seeing the inability to move forward because of factors that have nothing to do with data and science that are being injected into the process.
So you mentioned 1,600 employees in DEQ?
Right.
How many are lawyers?
Not enough. Okay. Just a handful.
Okay. So focusing a little bit on on North Carolina, how are drinking water and sanitation services provided to most people in North Carolina?
So the vast majority of people in North Carolina get their water from public water systems, about 75%. And then 25% of North Carolinians get their drinking water from private drinking water wells. So that is certainly something we have to think about as a state whenever we discover a new contaminant that's of concern. You've got one method through the Safe Drinking Water Act of approaching that from a public water system perspective, but there's very little regulation around private drinking water wells, but also a need. Tends to be more rural, in some cases, communities that are lower income that are relying on that system. So it's an interesting dichotomy to deal with.
Well, there's some historical issues about how this has happened here.
Right. There is. In fact, the way that Aaron and I met originally was through when the first tranche of funding was coming from the General Assembly, which was $1.6 billion. I reached out to Aaron for his advice because we realized that we had a deadline. It was money from the American Rescue Plan, which had a 5-year time horizon. So that money had to be expended within that 5 years, projects completed. So speed was of essence, but we didn't, speed and equity don't typically go together super well. Whenever you are moving fast, sometimes you're not getting the money to the places that need it the most. And so we did some quick work, and with the help of folks like you and others, Jackie McDonnell Gibson and other folks from the university system, we did some research and found that there were what's sometimes referred to as donut hole communities, which I think is a good way to think about it. It's where communities got bypassed for water and sewer services. And typically you find that those are communities of color, low-income communities that need that service the most, but do not have access. And you would think in 2024 that you would, in the urban areas like we're here in the Triangle area, that you wouldn't have those issues, that it might be more in the rural areas of the state. But you would be wrong. I was under that assumption and learned a lot, that even, in Apex, which is in a suburb not far from here, there was a community, I think I've got the numbers right, it's Iron Gate Drive.
Right.
And so Apex as a whole, I believe, is 18% African American. The community that got bypassed was 86% African American. So that's one example, and I know that some efforts have been made to try to get some service there, I believe, in recent years, at least on the sewer side. But we want to design a system that would help address some of those inequities. And so with the work of Shadi and his team and others within the department, we canvassed all the public health agencies in the state to find out which communities they were aware of that didn't have service. We then made one pot of funding. So of the $1.6 billion we had, about half of it was earmarked. The other half, about $800 million, was available for grants. That was one of the biggest grant application processes you've ever seen. We had $3.5 billion worth of applications requested. So we had to do a lot from an agency capacity standpoint to respond to that. But for part of that funding, we made it, if you were connecting folks to public water for the first time, then you were eligible for a separate part of funding. So that was another carrot incentive. So after we canvassed to find out where are those communities that don't have service, we then reached out to utilities that had adjacent service area to see, to make them aware of that and try to encourage them to apply. And so through that process and through the team doing a lot of outreach, we were able to connect over 2,000, or it's in the process. These projects are still being built, but around 2,000 homes to public water for the very first time in the state, which is great. Including maybe my favorite day on the job was in Sampson County. There is one community. This community's name is Ivanhoe. They have been really wanting water service for a long time. You hear stories from them about washing clothes and the clothes coming out brown. White clothes come out brown. You've got pumps that go out whenever it gets cold. And this community had concerns about the water quality for their drinking water wells as well. So I believe it's about $13.5 million grant providing service for over 300 homes to get connected for the first time. And the governor and I got to go out to that community to celebrate this grant. And I think the entire community showed up and was packed into this one room, and there were tears. People were so excited to actually be able to see this on the horizon, that they were going to get access to this, what we take for granted as a very basic service. So that's a little bit about some of what we've done to try to address the inequities that have existed within that.
So I know it wasn't as easy as just extending service. Once we started having those conversations, there were other conversations that started to happen with utilities and others about how this can be sustained. Do you want to reflect on some of those challenges?
One of the big challenges is when someone's not used to paying a water bill. Water affordability comes into play because that's not been something that they have to factor into their monthly budget. And so that becomes a barrier for folks wanting to take advantage of service even when it becomes available. And so I think, water affordability also, as we think about emerging contaminants like PFAS, the treatment technologies that are going to be required in order to meet the federal drinking water standard, and I'm sure that the administrator probably touched on this morning, perhaps a little bit.
Didn't talk about the financial consequences, though.
And part of that, EPA's got an estimate that, I'll tell you, this is one of the reasons that North Carolina is so invested in this. They think their estimates are about 5 to 10% of systems in each state will be not meeting the federal drinking water standard for PFAS. In North Carolina, we're right now at 22%. It is a huge issue here. Part of the reason for that is that we are a heavy industrial state. We have a lot of industries that have used PFAS as a part of their process. The reason I've petitioned EPA to make 4 PFAS compounds hazardous air pollutants is we also know that air emissions contribute to surface and groundwater contamination for PFAS. And so we are, looking at this from a standpoint of taking, I mentioned, so Chemours is a facility in southeastern North Carolina that's contaminating 8-county region. There are 2 drinking water treatment plants that are downstream of that facility. One of those is Brunswick County. They're in the process of installing a reverse osmosis system that should be operational at the first quarter of next year. Their rates have gone up 40% to pay for that. And so if you think about, just upstream, Cape Fear Public Utility Authority in Wilmington, their rates, they've seen a number of rate increases. I don't know what the total at this point is, but they're anticipating more. They've been going up a little, like 8% at a time. But, you couple the general affordability issue when you have a community that hasn't had access in the past and then is going to have to start paying a bill with the needs that our water systems are facing, both from an aging infrastructure standpoint. I mean, you think $6.5 billion is a lot of money, right? That seems like for one state. And I'll tell you that other states are envious that North Carolina has gotten this much. But it's only a drop in the bucket for what the state needs, because our infrastructure was installed many decades ago and has far outlived what is anticipated life was going to be. So there are broken pipes. There are systems that you've got pump stations that are in flood zones. You've got aging equipment. You name it, and we need to fix it. And so there's over $40 billion worth of estimated infrastructure needs, not including PFAS. And I know that the department's in the process of updating some of these numbers as we speak, but that's the latest EPA assessment that we've done. And so $6.5 billion is great. It's a drop in the bucket. So you couple that with, so those just basic needs to keep the systems running with
The increased costs.
Increased costs for treatment to treat for the contaminants that are of concern. And that's going to present a real problem. And we're going to have to look as government to programs. There was a program that expired in 2023 called LIWAP. We love a good acronym. It's a low-income water assistance program. And we're going to, there's a LIHEAP is the energy equivalent of that. LIHEAP is an ongoing program. LIWAP expired. So we've got to think about more assistance programs. I've had water directors talk to me about the need to change laws so that you can charge based on affordability, because right now you can't do that. So if you can have sliding scales, then perhaps you can make sure that there's more equity associated with the provision of water and sewer services while making sure that you can still take care of the capital needs that are so important.
Does North Carolina have any cutoff laws or regulations?
It varies based on the utility. There's some regulations for the Utilities Commission for those that are under their purview. So that'll be like more the private providers, like Aqua North Carolina, for example. But typically you have a certain amount of days, maybe it's 5 business days, that you have to have notice before you can cut off, and you have to have attempted to address the problem. There are some commonalities that you typically see, but nothing that's standard kind of across the board.
Okay, so that might have to go hand in hand with some of those affordability challenges
Right.
in order to protect. Absolutely. And Alexandra, are you here? There was good. Let's turn a little bit away to service provision. And by the way, you guys will have the opportunity to ask questions. So if you have a question that you want to ask during the conversation, there are microphones up on the sides, so you're willing to step up. And I would like to avoid having a huge line, so to speak, at the very end. And so you guys can go up as you hear this particular issue coming up, and we can see what we can do to get it in. So you mentioned PFAS. What do you see are some of the most significant challenges to the safety of drinking water here in North Carolina? Are there other things that you're concerned about as well?
So PFAS is the biggest issue, I'll say right now. I mean, we are seeing that, you think about 22% of our water systems not meeting the new federal drinking water standard. That's not including looking at private wells. One of the challenges, you mentioned I just finished my term as president of ECOS, working with the other state secretaries. Nobody has a lot of funding available to address private wells. The state revolving funds are geared towards public water systems. But private wells are a real big problem, because you can't, what I used to say is that as secretary, I can't in good conscience say there's one standard for people who are on public water, and if you're on private wells, good night and good luck. That's not a good answer to have. So one of the things that the department did that I'm really proud of is we came up with we've got a fund called the Bernard Allen Drinking Water Fund. Bernard Allen was a legislator who was a champion for low-income communities having access to clean water. They named a fund after him. The legislature expanded the use of that fund to include PFAS a few years ago. And what we did is we saw there was a growing need, especially, you think about, so we have industry, right, that's caused some contamination, but there's also AFFF or firefighting foam. Wherever you've had that deployed, whether it's close to an airport, or if it's a firefighting training facility, or just places that have had fires. where a lot of AFFF was used. You can find groundwater contamination issues. That's the thing about a forever chemical, is that it's not going to break down. Much like, is so much different than everything else we regulate, because everything else we regulate, you hear about natural attenuation. Over time, it's going to become less toxic. That is not the case with PFAS. PFAS just lingers. It accumulates. It's bioaccumulates. It's biopersistent. And then once it's in the environment, it's there until you actually capture it and destroy it. So we knew that this was a big issue including in rural parts of the state that were more reliant on private wells. So we developed a program that is income tested. So it covers up to 100% of the costs of both testing and filtration to enable homeowners who don't have another option to have an option to make sure that they can have safe drinking water for their family. So PFAS just generally, so that's the private well side, but I think that's really one of the biggest issues. 1,4-dioxane is another huge issue that I mentioned earlier. Like I said, likely carcinogen. It's a chemical solvent, so it's been used in a lot of industrial processes and released into our environment that way. And then I think something that's on the horizon that we're starting to hear conversation about, but I will say state agencies and EPA haven't really gone there yet, is microplastics. I think PFAS is overwhelming so many agencies to just respond to that need, that I'm pretty sure if you go and say you need to tackle microplastics too, that folks are going to beat their head against a wall, because it's just how do you manage all of these threats at the same time. But it is a big issue. I was talking with a Duke researcher the other day who is doing research on the impact of microplastics to our body. And that's the kind of research that we're going to need in order to take action from a public health perspective. And the interesting thing I learned is, and I've heard this one time, so hopefully I don't do his research justice, but it affects your cells at a cellular level because it's a foreign body in your body that it's reacting to, and so it has some cellular changes that are occurring. And then you also have over 12,000 chemical additives to plastic, and those chemicals are also leaching into your bloodstream. And so, one of the challenges I think about that we haven't done a wonderful job as government of doing is, how do you think ahead? So as we're getting ready to make all of these investments in water treatment technologies for PFAS, how are we also making sure that we are at the same time looking at what's going to treat for things like microplastic too? We can get to the causes of microplastic being in our water are plentiful, and that's going to be a very hard issue to get a grasp on too. But granular activated carbon doesn't work with microplastics. There's not great solutions here. Reverse osmosis does. Reverse osmosis then also creates a concentrated residual stream of waste. So you have a concentrate of PFAS and any of the other contaminants that you're pulling out. Something has to be done with too. So I think the other challenge that I see on the horizon as we're dealing with all of these emerging issues, and I say emerging issues, they're not recent emerging issues, right? We know PFAS has been around for many decades. We know 1,4-dioxane has been around. These are issues we're just starting to grapple with officially through methods like the Safe Drinking Water Act. But there's so many of those challenges, and then we have to think about the secondary and tertiary impacts of addressing that in drinking water. So, for example, when you have a granular activated carbon system added on to a water filtration plant, that carbon has to be refreshed, and it's typically refreshed thermally. Well, as I mentioned earlier, PFAS also travels through the air. So what we need to be careful that we're not doing is solving one problem and creating another. So, for example, if we're taking all the Gen X in North Carolina, that's just one of the Chemours-related PFAS chemicals, and then if it's being refreshed in a facility in New York, are we then creating a site?
You're aerosolizing it.
Yeah, you're aerosolizing it, and it's traveling. We know it can travel long distances.
In fact, what we found in the state was that a lot of the PFAS we were finding in well water was actually from aerosol deposition.
Exactly. And so around the facility itself, we're at 27 miles and counting where we see contamination that was caused from air emissions.
So this gets to the point you're a little bit making about life cycle costing.
Yes.
And how do you deal with that from a regulatory perspective without overburdening, let's say, taxpayer? Who pays? First of all, how do you assess that for some of these compounds, which are going to live forever? And then where do we pass those costs?
So this is something I'm pretty passionate about. Right now, ratepayers are taking on the bulk of the cost. There's a lot of litigation out there. So there are some cases that have been successful. There's been some consent orders reached. 3M in Minnesota was an $800 million settlement that has gone very quickly. This stuff is very expensive to handle. So I've been an advocate for surface and groundwater standards in North Carolina because, what's the first rule of thumb? If you've got a problem, you need to stop shoveling, right? You need to put the shovel down, stop digging your hole. And so if we can reduce the amount of PFAS that's entering the environment from here forward, that's going to be one piece of the puzzle. And that's going to help, like City of Raleigh is a good example. Raleigh has about 6 parts per trillion of PFAS. The limit is 4 parts per trillion. So they're just over. They can use a cheaper technology. They're using powder activated carbon instead of having to build a whole GAC facility. So that's going to be better for the ratepayers of the town, and if we can keep those levels that they're seeing low, then that's going to be a good thing. But for the 22% of systems that aren't meeting it, a lot of them are not going to be as fortunate. And so I think that industry that has caused this pollution needs to be at the table in some way, shape, or form. I think it's going to take probably congressional action to find some payment mechanisms that would put them more at the center of providing funding for the many communities that are going to be installing treatment. But we are far from a perfect solution, and that's getting back to your original point on water affordability. If we don't find a way to ensure that everybody who's been a part of that problem is at the table to help pay for it, we're going to overburden our residents.
So I did some work on WR Gray sites up in Boston. Mm-hmm. Is there an effort here within this state to go after some of the private industry and hold them accountable for some of this in a way that would provide some relief to the taxpayers?
There are ongoing lawsuits.
Okay.
Those lawsuits, though, take many years.
Right.
And so I think that the challenge for a lot of communities that are going the lawsuit litigation route is that it's not a quick turnaround. So you're going to have to install treatment before you're going to see a dime from any potential award.
Got it. And are there any questions of science within those lawsuits that still need to be addressed that would help allow those processes to kind of move forward?
I think the science is very clear. Okay. PFAS causes negative health consequences up to and including cancer. And so there are those who try to argue it, and those folks are in industry, and the ones usually responsible for it who want to try to, we were seeing in North Carolina, and this is an age-old industry playbook, right? You think about the tobacco industry hiring scientists to say that tobacco is fine. We're seeing the same thing happen here in the state as we've been moving forward with surface and groundwater standards, that you have, like, for example, the State Chamber of Commerce hiring industry, I'm going to say scientists very loosely, that, just to give you an example, when he was in academia, sent a academic paper to the American Chemistry Council to edit before he published it. We know that, there's a number of academic folks in the room, I'm sure, who know that that is a huge no-no. You don't do that. And the World Health Organization, actually, he had been a part, this is just one example, but, they disbanded their group that was working on the PFAS drinking water recommended standard that had set it at 100 parts per trillion. And industry was using it to say EPA is out of step. They're at 4 parts per trillion, and the World Health Organization is at 100. Well, they, come to find out, had ignored all the human health studies and had discarded a lot of information that they should have taken into account because of undue influence from industry-backed scientists. And so they have gone back to the drawing board on that standard and are working that again. So, those are the types of challenges that we face when we try to get others at the table. But the science, if you take that aside and those folks who are trying to cast doubt on the science, there is so much research, even just happening in our backyard. Just looking, ignore all the wonderful science that's happened around the world, just in our backyard in North Carolina, there's a ton of researchers working on this issue that are producing results that are, both proving that this is an issue that we need to address and address urgently for the sake of public health. But also, I'll tell you that I am regularly alarmed when I see what the latest science is, to see what the dangers are that we haven't even thought about yet.
Wonderful. We also have a large livestock population in North Carolina. Sorry. We also have a large livestock population in, I don't think we're going to have to ask what keeps her up late at night, but we may get there. We also have a large livestock population here in North Carolina. What role does that play in water quality issues?
So there's a couple different ways you could think about this, right? And since I'm talking about PFAS, I'm going to start there.
Okay.
You look at the different ways we're exposed. And so drinking water, and obviously water has been a big focus this week. And so we think about that. But we also have to think about our food supply. And there are many instances in other states where whole herds of cattle have been culled because they have grazed on land that was treated with biosolids that contain PFAS and other heavy metals. You've got a situation in southeastern North Carolina where organic farmer's well, he found out, was contaminated with Chemours-related PFAS contamination and had his crops tested and said, I can't sell these in good faith. The levels are so high. And so I think we're going to have to think, you think about agriculture and you think about some of the traditional issues of, runoff or pesticide use or, hog lagoons. You can think about those types of issues, but I think there's a whole different aspect that we've got to be thinking about, which is the quality of water that's going into producing our food, because that is another significant exposure route. Obviously, drinking water is the most important exposure route, but food is, there's yet to be a lot of data about, we need more data, I'll just say. We have some data. We need more data on how to calculate, what the impacts are on us from the food consumption versus drinking water.
So some of the direct sources we're now that, but these indirect connections we haven't quite mapped out yet, and the risks associated with them. I'm going to lead the witness a little bit, but what about AMR resistance?
Just for technology tell me more.
Well, whether that's also a threat in the state. I know that a lot of the livestock are being treated with antibiotics and things like that in the state. Is that finding its way into our water systems in ways that we also have to be worried about or having an impact?
I haven't heard a lot about that thus far. The DHHS is actually doing a lot of wastewater monitoring, and that's not just looking at issues like antibiotic resistance, but looking at seeing COVID instances, or they've used that a lot to say we are seeing a spike in the amount of COVID particles we're seeing in wastewater, or fentanyl. There's been, wastewater monitoring's been used for there, but that has been less of a focus of conversation in North Carolina.
Got it. We've seen the impacts of climate change, of course, in the state recently. How do you think climate or water security issues are impacting water quality here in the state and some of the challenges that you're facing?
Well, I think what we're dealing with right now is a great example. Asheville is a place that most people have been reading a lot of national news articles that said that Asheville had been considered a climate haven, right? Folks thought that you could go to Asheville and you're protected, right? That you're not going to have the impacts of climate change that you do if you're on the coast of North Carolina. You've got these big storm events coming in. We're used to places like Goldsboro and Kinston flooding. We are not used to seeing levels of flooding like we've seen in the western part of the state. And to have a storm come so quickly and really decimate an entire region is not something that the state has grappled with in the past. I don't even think we had we perhaps should have, but I don't even think the imagination was there to predict and fathom, an event like we saw with Helene. And so, that is presenting a whole host of challenges. You've got a lot of folks who don't even have access to some of the basic services right now. Trash collection, water and wastewater. Roads don't exist in places where they used to exist. Bridges have been knocked out. And so it's, there's a kind of first line triage that's having to occur right now as you're just trying to be able to provide basic infrastructure back to a region that just had it wiped out in a 24-hour period. And this was back-to-back storms too, we should mention, for those of you who aren't from North Carolina. We had a previous storm event, and then Helene was right on its heels. So the ground was already saturated. But you think about the water quality impacts of these types of events. Where you have water coming back on, but sewer service is not, operational, or vice versa. Just you hear stories about propane tanks floating down the river, right? You've got, it just disrupts so many things that you've got a lot of sediment that's been stirred up. So you have, I'm sure that they're thinking about E. coli issues that are associated with some of the water bodies that are there. But it's multifaceted. I think that's a good example of nowhere is safe from the effects of climate change, and thinking about a lot of these issues proactively into the future, maybe trying to imagine scenarios that don't seem fathomable today, but may actually happen in the future. There's no real way to prepare for something like what happened a few weeks ago, but it does point to the many, many concerns that arise when you have an event like that. And then we haven't even gotten to some of the secondary impacts, like how do you treat insurance? You look at California wildfires, but with more frequent flooding, a lot of these folks that were impacted in the mountains didn't have flood insurance. Why would they? They weren't in an area that was considered to be a high risk. So I think we're going to have to rethink a lot of things, water quality included, but that being one piece of the puzzle.
It caused me to rethink and look at the flood maps, and even though we were not in a zone that would traditionally qualify for flood insurance, when I looked at a 1 in 500 year event, I had to start rethinking that decision. And this is not something that we normally think about, but yeah, the world is different now.
Well, and NOAA is rethinking what they consider a 1 in 500 year event, because it's not 1 in 500 years anymore. It may be a 1 in 10 years or 1 in 5 years. We're seeing these, and so our measures that we've traditionally used for risk are no longer appropriate for the current conditions.
So it doesn't sound like that, let's say, long-term droughts and things like that. Well, variability is certainly going to play a havoc with all of us no matter what. But in terms of water security, what do you see as kind of the key threats then in North Carolina?
Cybersecurity is an issue. I know EPA and President Biden have been at the forefront on this and asking states to address it. You think about other risks beyond climate change to water systems, and cybersecurity is certainly a concern because that could knock out service for folks without having a natural disaster. I think that we've mentioned a lot. I won't recover the ground we've already covered.
You did mention, we've had previous conversations about industry and future industrial growth having an impact on water security in the state.
Yes.
How do you think about the role of industry, and is there a permitting process? How does this happen when new industries come to a state? Mm-hmm. What role does the state have in saying yes or no, and do you base their impact on water as part of that decision?
So the state has the ability to issue, obviously, if they're going to have a discharge, then the state's going to permit that discharge. There's stormwater regulations. There's kind of the traditional processes that are in place to handle water quality issues. One thing we haven't done a lot of thinking about as a state, because we traditionally have been very water rich, is water quantity. What we're seeing is a lot, and it's probably because we've traditionally been a water rich state, you're seeing a lot of industries locate here that are water intensive. And so, I started hearing concerns from downstream utilities that they're concerned, with these large industries taking up a whole lot of water upstream. What's that going to do to them downstream? Are they going to, have less water available to them in the future? How are they going to support their growing population? Also ensure water quality. So they, are vocal advocates for making sure that we're, stringent on standards and have as many permit conditions as possible to ensure that the water they're getting isn't, is still usable. Because that's the other thing, is that you can have water available, but if it's contaminated, then that water is not truly available, minus the investment in treatment technology, which comes at a cost. So I think, one of the things that we had been working on is a regionalization study for a section of the state that's seen a lot of development. And I think as we're seeing more, climate swings where there are times we've got flooding, too much water, and there's times we have drought and not enough. I mean, fortunately, we haven't had a drought like I think the 2007 drought was the last big drought the state had, but we flirted with drought in recent years. I mean, there are times where a lot of the state is either abnormally dry or in some level of drought. Traditionally not the most severe level, but fortunately rain has come and prevented us from having to go into restrictive measures. But that's going to become, I think, a bigger issue moving forward with the growing population, with industry, and how, knowing that decisions that are made upstream are going to affect downstream residents.
Okay. So what does keep you up at night, and what's going to motivate you as you go forward?
There's a lot that keeps me up at night, as you can tell. PFAS certainly keeps me up at night. You could ask anybody on the DEQ team, and they'll tell you that.
Does your daughter sit in on your meetings?
My daughter luckily does not, but she hears enough about it at home. So I've got a 14-year-old daughter who I think hears more about this than she cares to sometimes. But I think getting our arms around PFAS is one big thing, and if we think about acid rain, if we think about ozone, we've faced issues like this before. It's not that it's insurmountable. And so I do want to, since I've talked about PFAS so much today, I do want to leave you all with that. This is a fixable problem. It's just going to take a lot of will, a lot of resources, and a lot of action to come together and get our arms around it and fix it. We're going to have to. So that's one thing, thinking about not just what's right in front of us with meeting the drinking water standard. That's enough to keep you up at night. I see some of our DEQ team that I'm sure that keeps them up at night as well. But how are we approaching this from a holistic standpoint to ensure that whether it's PFAS or whether it's something else we haven't even discovered yet? I mean, that's really what keeps me up at night, is what do we not know about yet? How are we thinking holistically, thinking about the life cycle, right? Thinking about all the different ways that these contaminants are getting into the environment and ensuring that we're protecting public health. Because the biggest, the thing that always kept me up at night was thinking about what's the next Gen X, right? So Gen X, for those of you who don't live in North Carolina, that's the PFAS compound produced by the Chemours facility in North Carolina. That it was a front page news article, I believe it was June 7th of 2018, 2017, that basically that was a moment in time that really shifted North Carolinians' knowledge of the issue, the fear around the issue, and made North Carolina a leader by necessity. What's the next thing? What's the next Gen X on the front page of the Wilmington Star News or whatever newspaper it happens to be? That's what keeps me up, and that's why I think about microplastics. While I'm thinking about some of these other issues that we know are on the horizon that we don't quite have enough bandwidth, quite frankly, to deal with yet. But yes, I left my position, as you noted, just about a month ago, looking forward to finding ways to continue to work on these issues, take what North Carolina has learned and apply those lessons elsewhere, and hopefully continue to make an impact from a different seat.
Great. I don't remember where I got this, but my understanding is you're a voracious reader.
I am.
And you read multiple nonfiction books at the same time. What are you reading now?
Right now, I'm reading a book called Build Like a Woman, and it's a book about female entrepreneurship. And since I am getting back into that realm, it's a really enjoyable read. There's one of the issues that you see is a lot of leadership books and a lot of entrepreneurial books are written by men. There's not a lot written from the perspective of a woman. And it's something that I reflected on when I took this role originally, is that I've read a lot of leadership books, and I was going back to my bookshelf and struggled to find any written by a woman. And being the first woman in this role, it took me a little bit of trial and error figuring out what does my style look like. Just for anybody who goes into a leadership role like this as a first of your kind, I'll give you the cheat sheet. And that is, the secret is just to be yourself. And your leadership style might look different than other people's leadership style, and that is okay. And you embrace that, you're authentic, and you'll be successful that way. But yeah, so that's the current book.
In that vein, we'll leave you with a gift that will hopefully add to your book collection.
Awesome.
But Secretary Beiser, thank you so much for
Thank
your
you
time with
so
us
much.
today.
Appreciate it.
No, thank you. Okay.